The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Premier was asked if he was opposed to downloading of costs to Nova Scotia due to the federal Harper government's Justice Bill C-10. The Premier stated at the time that he hoped that the federal government would pay for any extra costs to the province. Mr. Speaker, this is becoming more and more unlikely to happen. Ontario, Quebec and Newfoundland have come out and said that they reject the download of these increased costs to their provinces and the extra demands it would place on their justice systems. My question to the Premier is, will the Premier come out and oppose the downloading of these increased costs onto our province by the federal Harper government?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've already said, both in this House and publicly, that if there are increased costs as a result of Bill C-10, that burden should not be borne by the Nova Scotia taxpayers, that the federal government should fund any increases in cost.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear in Ontario, Quebec and Newfoundland where their government stands. They've been very public in doing so, whereas our Premier seems to be more hopeful rather than coming out and standing up for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, this crime bill could have significant cost to Nova Scotia and significant impact on our justice system. Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that the provinces will be faced with costs of between $6 billion and $10 billion over the next 5 years. The Prime Minister has indicated that assistance to the provinces is highly unlikely, and reports from federal justice officials only seem to validate the estimation that the provinces will have to shoulder these costs alone. Mr. Speaker, with the province already suffering from NDP cuts, how does the Premier plan to pay for the federal Conservatives' crime bill?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the member would know, we are coming up to the new negotiations for transfers for the provinces. This is something that's being addressed by the Council of the Federation. I can assure the member opposite that we take into account all of the programming that the federal government undertakes when we look at the questions of the envelopes of funding in the transfer program. So, Mr. Speaker, that will form part of what we will do as those negotiations go forward. And of course, we're raising our objections, as we have already said, with the federal government.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I would certainly hope that if the Premier is going to Ottawa with his colleagues to fight for more money for the provinces, that's for things such as infrastructure, health care and education, and not for jails here in our province, because that's certainly not the priority of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, again, this is a significant cost that could not only face our province, but certainly put an additional burden onto the justice system of our province. Being that the Premier has indicated he will soon be going to visit the federal government, would he indicate whether he's going to bring these concerns directly to Ottawa, that Nova Scotia does not want to see any of the costs of Bill C-10 downloaded onto our province?
The honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I already have.